All right, welcome everyone. So today what I want to do is talk to you about materials and setting up your project for rendering for your packaging project. But this is also how you're going to set up stuff for when you're creating your final project. So let's go ahead and get started. First things first, making sure we're in object mode. And these different modes up here, of course, relate to what you're doing. So if you're just selecting different objects to focus on, you could do it in the object mode. This is also the better spot to play with materials and stuff when you get to that point. Edit mode actually allows you to edit the specific object you're working on. So if you wanted to change something, you would switch to edit mode. First object, select an object. Then when you switch to edit mode, it focuses on that object to edit. So you can see that I've got my grid structure here, the wireframe in the owl, and I don't have anything else selected. So this is when I can modify just this one object, which is what we did in the last one when we cleaned up the geometry. But also what's nice is if I don't have my orbit working properly, of course we're orbiting with the middle mouse button. If I go to view here while I have something selected, I can go to frame selected, and that will enable me to, or go to object mode, and then frame selected, which is under view, frame selected, or the period on the number pad, which a lot of you don't have number pads, but that's where it is if you're not using that. So now when I orbit, it only orbits around that object, makes it really nice and easy, and you can do that with just the eye, view, frame selected, and now I'm just playing with the eye. Okay, so we're going to start by maybe making materials for the eyes, and I'm thinking maybe we can make them glow or something. So I've got the eye selected. We want to make sure we have the right thing selected. Okay, it's highlighted, and then we go over here and click on the materials button. By default, it already has a material that it brought in from Rhino. If you're not doing anything super tricky, you can just modify that one, but remember that it is attached to anything you see purple, so it will change the material for that. So if you wanted to, you can create a new material just with the little plus button over here. And then that material, you click on new, and you get all the parameters to make a new material. And then what I want to do is actually click on the one that was on there before and then hit the minus button. So that doesn't delete the material from your material library, it just removes it from that object, okay? So then there's a few things we can modify over here in the simplest form. So if we're doing solid colored parts, it's pretty easy. Gets a little bit more complex if we're doing patterns and textures and typeface and that kind of stuff, but we'll get to that. So we'll start off with a base color. And if I change my base color, I can change it to, say, yellow, make it super bright, and you'll see that it changes there. Other parameters on here are things like roughness. You don't really mess with specular too much. Metallic is cool to mess with a little bit, and you can just play with these, and you might even watch another tutorial video or something like that to see what all the parameters do. But some of the ones that I like to play with are roughness. If I lower the roughness down to 0, it makes it high gloss, and you can see the reflection of the environment that I've got by default there shining on the eye. So if I like that, I can just keep it. But you might also want to change the emission. So right now the emission is black, which means no emission. If I change it to white, it glows white, and then I can change the color to have it glow different colors. Change this to white. And it'll mostly show up when we're doing our rendering. So emission, and you can change how transparent it is with your alpha here. And if you click on this, it changes it. 1 basically means 100%. So if I change this by clicking and dragging on it, I can make it somewhat transparent. Now we're in a material preview mode. This is not the render preview mode. So if we wanted to really see how it's going to look, you've got to click right here, and then you can see it's kind of glowing that green color. So this is the render preview, and it will give you kind of an example of how the lighting is hitting and the emission is working. Okay, so this is just a layer preview. This is going to be your least impactful of the solid options. You've got solid, you've got, this is a material preview, and this is a render preview. So the render preview is when more of the lighting kicks in. And then of course wireframe here, you can actually see the wireframe. But mostly I leave it in this mode until I'm ready to render, then I put it in this mode, and then of course when I want to check everything, I put it in the render mode up here. Okay, so I've got that one material. Now I want to make this same eye over here the same material. So I'm in object mode, I select the other object, and then I can actually come to my material window here, scroll up if you don't see it, and then I can add a new material. And if I click on the drop down box here, we've got our material that we made earlier right here. And then I click on this and minus it, and we've got the same material. So once you create the material, it is in your library and you can use it in other spaces. So that's kind of how to create a glowing effect. Pretty simple. Colors, glow, transparency, all of that. It's all right there. Okay. So that's pretty easy to do, and you can use that pretty nice effect. The most important thing to have actually when we're exporting to other programs, if you're not just using a base color material, if you're using like type or a poster or something with an image on it or some sort of a bump texture, that's when we get into UV mapping, which is a little bit more complicated. So let's go ahead and UV map the owl head. Okay. We're going to start with a little bit easier form, which is called texture painting, and then we're going to go into a more detailed portion of it with maybe creating a tiled background for the background, or even some texture for the chest of the owl. But for the head of the owl, we're just going to go ahead and UV unwrap it and use the UV map to paint on this. So you can spray paint, you can create all different types of cool effects this way. So let's go to texture paint. All right, and then under texture paint, we've got two windows now. This window over here that's black is going to be something that we're just going to go ahead and get rid of. And then we're going to go to new, because you'll probably see it like this. We go to new, and we're leaving it square. We always leave it square. Square is the best thing for game engines and for render quickness. It uses something called a MIP map, which we will explain in much greater detail when we get to the final project. Just know square powers of 2 is what we're looking at. And so 1024 by 1024 is actually a pretty good size. Depending on the size of the object, that might even be a little bit too big. You could get away with something a little bit better. So we're going to do black, leave alpha selected, generated type blank, and then go ahead and say OK. Then we're going to come back over here, go to object mode, click on the object, then we'll go over here to texture paint. All right. And then what we need to do is we need to set this image, because you can see I'm painting here and it's not going on anything. We need to set this image to the material on here. So let's go ahead and do that. Image, save, and I'll go ahead and put it under materials. I've created a folder for it, and make sure it's a PNG. And we'll call it owl body. And we'll save it as an image. Okay. Then we need to assign that to this object. So if I go over to my object mode, select the object, go to the materials here, and you can see I've got base color set here. We want to change that to a texture image, or image texture. All right. And then it seems like we're going to go to open, and materials and owl body PNG, open image. There we go. Switch this back to texture paint. And now, if we paint on the owl, it paints over here, okay? And it should paint in relationship to a flattened out version of the UV. So let's see here. And I'm just goofing around, but you can see it paints it on a 2D version over here. And then what we can do is we can still play with all of the same parameters, metallic, how rough it is. I can make it super glossy, and it will still have those parameters that we can manipulate. Glossy, rough, and you can also fill in the whole background as well. So let's go to properties up here. If you're not seeing your brushes and stuff, you go to properties here, and then you've got your different brushes and your mix, your radius, your strength, all that kind of stuff. So if I wanted it all white, I can also paint over here too. But it's actually better to paint on the actual 3D object, because if there are areas that don't overlap quite right, it will fix that for you. All right, so I've got that painted all white. And then I'm going to change my color and maybe do a little bit bigger radius. A little pink stripe down the front. And you can see the shape of the eyes. You can see the kind of cutout shape. This is all the UV map, which we're going to get more into in a minute. There we go. So that is texture painting, and of course there's a ton of tools and stuff you can play with in here. And as you find your way through here and have some fun, you know, do what you got to do to make the texture look the way you want. And then we switch to UV editor mode, and then hit A over here, and now you can really see the UV. So if I hit this is in edit mode here, and then I hit A, it selects all the UVs. And then you can see in here the pattern of the UV map. And what's really cool about this is if I go to UV up here and go to export UV, and I export it as a PNG, owl body PNG, put it in my materials, export UV layout, I can actually come over to my materials folder that's in Blender project. Materials, owl body, right here. And I can open this one with Adobe Photoshop. And now this is really where the magic happens for graphic designers, because this is where you're going to actually create all of your labeling and your design, and you're going to actually put it onto the UV map in relationship to the format of the owl. So, and of course you can also use Illustrator too for this. But In this case, you can use Photoshop, and if you have like a label that you've designed, you just have to do like a transform and kind of get it to lay where you want it to be on the separate sections. That's also why we make different sections of the owl or your packaging with different materials have different layers, because you notice this UV map is only for the body. So if you've got like a rim or something you wanted that goes around like a packaging that you really want to have just that part have the label on, we've already got it on different materials. So let me just show you how that works. Let's switch back to Photoshop. I'm just going to put some kind of a funny image in. So let's go ahead and file, open, and I've got on my desktop. All right, so I'm going to open this flower image. Just pull it down so I can drop it down. Press A for all, select and drag it, or Control A, sorry. V, there we go, and then move it over here. And then I've got this image, I need to transform it. First I'm going to rotate it. And then I'm going to put it behind there so I can kind of see. Now with my UV map here, I've got a little bit of issues. These little pieces over here are kind of in a weird spot. You know, let's go back to the original Blender file and go to UV and go to Smart UV Project here. Project, I think. And then go OK. And see, that breaks it into all of these little shapes that are kind of arranged this way. I don't know that I like that. I think it was better before. So we can just unwrap here. It should put it back. Okay. But that does make it all one piece, which is kind of nice. But you can see it no longer fits this. So I'll just Control Z, Control Z. Okay, this is the standard UV map. That'll work fine for this one. But you can see that if it's not working, you can change the way it unwraps to a couple of different options here. All right, so we got that. We got this. Now, if I just go File, first we got to flatten the image, right? Make it all flat, merge visible, boom, File, export as PNG, and we'll just go ahead and call it 2. Save. But you can see I can do all kinds of free transform, whatever you need to do to make this line up the way you want it to. And then when you go back to the owl, I can actually change the material on the owl. So go to materials, and I'm going to add a new one, and then go to new, and then where it says base color, click here, and then I'm going to go to image texture, and I'm going to open my materials, owl body 2 PNG, open. Okay, then we click on this one, and we delete it. Oh. Let's go to layout. There we go. Well, I guess I needed to get rid of the wireframe. Okay, so yeah, let's go back to our Photoshop file real quick here. Make sure that we Control Z, and we'll delete this, and then File, export as PNG. Replace, yes. So you can also do your drawing and your painting on the 2D object in Photoshop or whatever, just and bring it in here. Let's go to open. Okay. And you can see I was complaining about this seam that's in the middle here, and you can totally see what I meant by that. And there's some weirdness where it puckers and stuff like that, but this form is kind of an odd form. So if you're having issues with the UVs, you can also rotate and move things to make it work a little bit better in that UV map itself. Again, we can lower the roughness on this and have it shine. But you can see that's good for backgrounds, it's good for labeling stuff. The other thing I want to show you is what we call normal mapping. And normal mapping, what that is a way of creating a texture on top of your image. So if I go back to Photoshop here and I make this a normal map by going to 3D or going to Filter, 3D, Generate Normal Map, it will change the look of this to take into consideration the surface of the object. So you can see, let's just do it flat here. Cube, whatever. Okay, so you can see the actual side here has areas that are sticking up. Okay, and if it's going the wrong way, you can invert the height, and then you can, of course, increase detail, increase the blur. But I think I'm going to go ahead and not invert the height. Let me just reduce the blur. There we go. And then hit OK. And this is what we call our normal map. So if I go File, and then I can go to Export as PNG again, and then this time call it normal. Okay, so we've exported our normal map. Now how do you apply it to this object? We're going to go into something a little bit more complicated here called shading. Shading brings up this right here, which is the details of the material. And this seems like I've got the wrong thing selected. Let me make sure I've got the right thing. So there we go, select that. I can tell because I didn't have this image file on here. So we've got the image of the PNG right here going into the base color. And this is what this is going to be our nodes area. And it's very similar to what you've got with Unreal Engine. So learning this is going to help you out with the next program as well. Pulling in off of normal here, I've got a texture coordinate set up. I'm going to delete that. And then I'm going to add a node. I'm going to go to a texture, go to image texture, put it right there, go to open, materials, and we'll find our normal map. Open image, and then we're going to take that color, the yellow, or no, where is it? Plug it in right there. All right, well, we got to stop real quick because I actually messed up on this normal map here. So we created our image texture and we applied our normal map to it. And I actually hooked it up straight to the normal here. Can't do that. So what we have to do next is add another node, and this time we're going to add a vector, normal map vector, put it right there, and you can see the colors match. So yellow goes to yellow, and then purple to the normal. And that is actually going to give us the texture that we're looking for. And you can change the strength, so I can reduce the normal map strength just with this little slider. And there you have it. All right, I kind of have some materials and stuff set here. So let's get into rendering. So you'll spend a lot more time in here playing with things, adding different textures. This is really going to be the fun part where you're making your own stuff. I added a little bump map here of a texture I made in Illustrator. So I made an Illustrator file that was square, 1024 by 1024, and then I made it so it's repeatable. So that's why when you line it up in Photoshop, it repeats. So you got to think about tiled textures as having these repeating forms. This is really nice for making bricks or whatever else. So you have a lot of freedom when it comes to using Illustrator to model this stuff. So That's going to be our bump map, or our normal map, I'm sorry, that I made in Illustrator, brought into Photoshop, overlaid on top of the UV map that we exported from Blender. So it's a lot of stuff, but once you wrap your head around all of this, it's really, you get used to how all of this software works, and you can make really cool visualizations, even with like After Effects and other stuff. It's all going to be very similar parameters. Okay, so now we're ready to render. Some things by default, we bring a light in, right? So this thing up here is our light, and we can see that it is not in our plane. And if I can grab different objects and move them around by using the G command, okay? So if I hit G, it grabs it. If I want to lock it into a axis on the world axis here, so it's not just going all over the place, if I hit X, it locks it into the X axis, and I can move it over this way. If I hit Y, it moves it into the Y axis, and I can move it this way. And then Z, of course, is up and down, which is really nice. But I'm going to use Y, or X, and kind of move it over there. And then I like to switch my view to a different viewport orientation. I'll go to top here so I can see where the light is in relationship to my object. And then I select it, G for grab, and I can lock it into Y, move it a little bit in front. Okay, so that's my default light. And if I click on the light, you get these parameters over here. Now you can see that this is here. If you're not seeing it, it's because it's not clicked. See, it doesn't exist. And now the parameter for the light. So right now it's set at point by default. You can have it be sunlight, spotlight, or area light. I find the area lights kind of look like rectangular lighting panels. So we're kind of trying to create like a set scene. So we're going to use an area light. And I want it to be pointed, so I just grab that little node there. Try to get it pointed. Right where I want it. And you can see that it's got a little box on it. If I click on it, I can type S for scale and make it bigger. So, and this is going to act just like a light would in the real world. So the closer the light is to it, the harsher the light, the further away, the more diffuse, but the more powerful the lighting actually has to be, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm going to get this kind of set the way I want before I create another one. And I can create another one by clicking it. By Control X and Control Z, we'll copy the exact same light, same size. Okay. So duplicate it. So I've got light and light 1 here. And then if I wanted to edit the parameters, of course, I can just click on this and I can bump up the power of it. This one, bump up the power of it. If you wanted to add more different types of lights or add anything to this scene, this is a really handy thing. You go Shift A and it brings up this menu. This might be one of the most important menus in Blender. So Shift A, and I can go to light, and then you can actually select. I can go with an area light and it'll bring it in. And by default, it just puts it right where our home point is, which if you remember when we exported from Rhino is right there, that little point right there. So if I go G now, I can go ahead and start to manipulate this. All right, so let's look at it in our rendered preview here real quick, just to kind of get a feel for how the light's looking. Click over here on rendered preview. And you can see the reflection of those lights on the owl because I've got a nice reflective surface. And you want to kind of control where those are, right? So maybe we'll G, kind of get them arranged a little better. So G, Y, and then if I go R for rotate, allows me to rotate it. And then again, if I can lock it in by Y, lock it in by X. Boom. All right. Then I think I want to move this one. Let me just delete that one with the delete key. And I think I'm going to delete this one too. And I'm just going to use 2 of these. So I'm going to go ahead and right click here. Or just, you can actually do object duplicate. I believe it's in here. Yeah, duplicate objects. So now you've got 2 lights with the same parameters, which is going to be good for ensuring that one of them's not more strong than the other. So select these 2 lights, and let's kind of move them. And I'll switch to a top view again. And see, everything is being done in object mode right now, because object mode is really good for moving things around and selecting different objects. Editing mode is when you get into actually modifying the objects themselves. So let's go ahead and go to view, port, top, shift tab to pan around the space, click on this, shift click on this, G, and I can kind of move it that way. All right, cool. And look at the reflection on the owl a little bit. So now I can actually keep playing with that to move it to where I want it to be and get it to how I want it to look. So that's lighting, okay? And there are a lot of things you can do with lighting for fall off and changing the custom properties. You can do things in the shading window as well to add nodes to lights and stuff. Really a lot of powerful things to do with lighting, but the basics should work for now. Okay, now we're ready to talk about rendering. Yay! Okay, so we've got our lights, we've got our scene, we've got our materials. Now what we want to do is create a render of it. You might have recognized that there's this little thing way over here. That is our camera. And if we click right here, it'll put our view into the camera view. And that's what's going to be rendered. So this camera is going to be an important thing to have in the right position. The way I do it, as I typically, you can either just grab it and move it around and kind of get it lined up where you want and go to a top view and that kind of stuff. Or if you've got it selected, you bring out this little window here, and under view, you can go camera to view. And that, when I toggle in, will mean that I can actually move this where I want, and it's moving the camera. So my screen view is going to be the view of my camera. And I can go to view, frame selected. Back out a little bit. Okay. And if you don't have a camera, for some reason, you should have one, but if you don't, remember Shift A will bring up this, and the camera's right there. Okay, so fun stuff with the camera, right? When we have our camera selected, let's go back. This is good framing, I think. So I'm going to go back here, I'm going to click on my camera, and then we get the little camera window here. This is just going to be like photography, right? So when you're shooting packaging design or something like that, you want to use a compression. You don't want to have like dramatic angles like you wouldn't shoot packaging design with a wide angle lens, unless you want to be like maybe insinuating an environment for like athletic shoes or something like that. But typically a 50mm lens, you could even go up to 80mm. It's going to give it really nice compression. And let's switch back to the view of the camera so we can see it now. So you can see the difference between the 50 here and the 80. Or let's go, we've got 80 here. If we change it to 12, which is super wide angle, right? Then when I select this object in view, frame selected, you can see the owl is distorted and kind of out of whack, right? So this is where the cameras really kind of come in handy. So let's go back out and select our camera again, and we'll switch it back here to 80. And then switch my view back to the camera and zoom out. And as long as I've got the camera selected, it's fine. I can make my modifications to the camera. So basically everything you have selected is what you're going to be working on, right? Okay, so if you're missing something, you probably don't have the right thing selected. Now we've got an 80mm focal length. I like to use depth of field, especially like you can put if you put like a scene in the background, like say a forest or something like that. If you use like a Gaussian blue or a Gaussian blur in the background, it's going to look like it's actually in a forest because you don't have to worry so much about detail because the background's going to be blurred out anyway. So you can put whatever you want on your backdrop and use that with the blur to really create some cool, interesting things. You can even bring the backdrop into like Illustrator and create like all kinds of cool patterns or whatever you want to do. Really just have fun in Photoshop and Illustrator and applying those things to this before the final rendering. This, again, very simple version. So I'm going to click on my depth of field here and you'll see it blurs out. I can click on my little picker here and you can see where do I want the focus to be. Maybe I'll go with the owl eye. Okay. And then my f-stop, right? So f-stop in photography is basically the amount of light that's coming in, but also it creates a blur in the background. So the more of a higher f-stop, the more blur in the background. So if you want it to be super sharp, like for a landscape photograph, you usually use around an f-stop of 11. For portraiture, 2.8, or even you can go down to like 1.8 on the f-stop. And really get like the eye in focus and nothing else. But for packaging, you're going to want to play with this to make sure that you're getting enough of the scene in focus to make it really work. So I'm just going to go ahead and use 2.8. And there's some other parameters in here, of course, you can kind of play with, but I think 2.8 is really nice. And then we need to talk a little bit about environment too. So we're going to go to our render settings next. So click up here, this is render settings. And right now we've got the render engine set as Eevee, which is cool for now because it isn't so taxing on your computer and you can really get kind of a feel of what things look like. But we're gonna change that to what we call cycles. Now this is gonna really impact how your computer runs. And here you can kind of see my paint job and you know, all of the things that are kind of coming through on this object here. So let's see, I must have multiple materials on here. I gotta change that out. That's some old material on there. Okay, so I went back to the UV map to find out why I had the wrong texture on there, and it turns out that I still have a little star next to my image, and this is super important. So this means I did not save my texture painting. So if I come up here and I just go to save, it will save it, that star is gone, and now when I go back and I apply this material, it should be the updated texture paint that we did. So that's what happened. So I switch back to my layout, go to normal kind of view here, and I removed it, but I'm going to put it back. So let's just do this. And that. Make sure it looks right. Yeah, okay. So that's the updated texture. All right. Now I created a new material, so I'm gonna turn down the roughness so it's nice and shiny again. Okay. Let me put it back in material view here. Click on my camera. Okay, that's my camera angle I've got set. Let's talk about some more. Okay, so a few things about rendering. So if you click on this little tab here, you can see that you have different rendering options. By default, it's on Eevee. We're going to change it to Cycles. Cycles is a better rendering engine. And for me, I'm going to put it under GPU compute because I have a fast GPU, but maybe if you have a Mac, the CPU might be better. That is kind of up to your own discretion. Then we've got render. That's how many passes it does to trace the light. And 300 is a good one for your final render. Might be too big, depending on your computer. You might have to reduce this a little bit. Basically, the more this is, the longer your render time is. About an hour render for your final render is a good one. Lower the passes down to do preview renders. So if I lower it down to like 41 and I go to render by hitting F12, you can see it'll be really kind of noisy and not so great. So it renders quicker though. 41 is very low. For viewport rendering, what that means is when I've got it in the render view, it's how many iterations it does every time you change the camera direction. So you can see it kind of pops into focus. The lower this number, the quicker it'll pop into focus. But the higher the number, the more like the final rendering it will be. So I'm going to leave that at 16. I'll leave that at 41 for now. Actually, no, I'm going to bump mine up to 300. I'm going to just pretend like this is a final rendering. Okay. So the other things you want to change is under this tab here where it says print, you want to change the image size. So you might want to make it 3K or 4K. So that's, I don't remember the resolution, but I'm just going to make something up. And then you can see it changes the width. And then the height, I'll make it. Make sure you're using a poster size aspect ratio. Just look it up if you don't know. And it should be really nice and detailed up in these numbers here. Okay, and then you're not going to stop any of these. You're going to now go to the next one down. Oh, 2 down. So this is scene. So you want to now set a kind of a background for your scene. Oh, I'm sorry, world. My bad. World, not scene. So for your world, you've got a background, and you can set the background to be an image or whatever you need it to be. And you can look more into that if you want to make it an image, but I think for packaging design, you're probably not going to need to mess with this much. I'm just trying to create like a studio environment, right? So I'm going to toggle out of my camera here and look at my background. I've got my background set to black, but you can set it to whatever color you want. I can set it to blue so that the light or the background that's reflected will be blue. Or you can set it to white. And that way the reflection almost looks like light or something like that. So that's the background. Other backgrounds you can do, let me think if I know where it is, edit preferences, and you can go to dynamic sky right here under lighting. I guess it is right there. And then you can go to install. Oops. Dynamic lighting. Materials. Install add-on. And then you can come over here and go to create, dynamic sky, create. And then under the world setting where we are right here, now we've got dynamic 1. And so that's going to give us a sky background basically. And you can change the sky color and hue and stuff. So this is just kind of going over different parameters for backgrounds that you can use for your renderings. Okay. I'll go ahead and close this. Go back to view here. These tools all do different things. View is the good one to keep it on, I think. All right. Now we are ready to do our final render, I think. So everything is all set the way you want it to be. You've got your view lined up. Check your camera. Make sure your f-stop set the way you want it to be. select the border here. I can, or just go up here, select camera. There we go. And then you've got your camera settings. I'm going to up my f-stop a little bit. I rendered this once and I didn't like the 2.8, so I'm going to go a little bit higher. I'm going to go to 3.8. All right, and I think now we're ready to go. So I'm going to hit F12, and that's going to give us our rendering. And once this is done, I'll come back. Okay, so I can see the way this is turning out at this point. I'm going to stop it. And I can stop it just by hitting the X here. It might make your computer freak out a little bit, but that's why we save, right? So we'll save often. So let's file and just save this bad boy so that it doesn't change on us or crash on us or something like that. All right, so I noticed that it's too bright. It's too bright in here too. So I feel like I could actually just lower the intensity of these lights and, you know, watch them diminish. So if I bring this down to maybe 500, and I want to keep it uniform, change both lights to 500. I guess they are parented to each other, so 500. Nope, that's this one here, 500. And we can wait for it to cycle in. All right, so we lowered the lighting a little bit down. Now let's go ahead and I want to play with one more thing on materials before we get going here. Let me get out of the camera. I want to show you how to make things glass. So if I select these and go to my material here, and we've got transmission. If we bump that all the way up to 1, then bring down the roughness, then when we render it out, it'll look a bit more like glass, and that'll be helpful when you're making your packaging design, probably. Okay. So let's go ahead and give the render a shot one more time. Hit F12 to render, and let's see what we get. That's before. Okay, and here is the rendering result. Let's go ahead and look at what we've got going wrong here. So, not quite the quality I want. Gets pixelated, noisy. So let's switch back over here and talk a little bit more about graphics card rendering. So, close that, come back here. And then what we're going to be doing is we want to make sure under our rendering tab, we had CPU compute, we changed it to GPU compute, but it was blacked out because we forgot to go under Edit, Preferences, System. By default, it's set to none. Set it to CUDA, and it will bring in whatever graphics card you have if it's compatible. So if you can actually use your graphics card, it'll have a check mark next to it if you can check it. I have it on CUDA, GeForce, and you can see over here, when I go to none, it's grayed out. So that's why things have been running a little bit slower than they should typically. So I've got those selected now. Now when I use the rendered view, switch the camera, it'll render in a lot quicker. And I can even up the cycles to 50. And it will come in pretty nicely. And that'll also make my render go much quicker. So I've decided I don't like the sky. I'm going to go to the world settings here, and I'm going to get rid of that dynamic sky and just put back a new black background. And maybe make it gray. And switch back to camera. And now I'll hit F12 to render again, and we'll see how much quicker it goes. Still not liking the noise. So then let's come back and go to render settings again. Go to denoising, and I'm going to select OpticX. It works with my GPU, but it might not work with yours, so NLM or OpticX are the two that you want to use. Number of cycles, and I can also come to film here if I wanted to lower the exposure down a little bit. All right, I think that's good. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the camera one more time. And I'm going to set my camera to a different focal length here. No. There we go. That's good. And what f-stop am I using here? 3.8. I think that's good. All right, so let's go ahead now and render it out. We've got the denoiser turned on and see how it looks. You can already see under the beak here how nice the denoiser is working to clean up the blur. Also the focal length I think I fixed a bit, and it's looking much better this time. I think I'll be happy with this rendering. Alright, and so here's the render result. Came out pretty good. You can see when I zoom in pretty good it starts to pixelate, but for the most part pretty nice. I like the glass on the toes. I think that's a nice little touch. And you get a good feel for how the lighting can be adjusted. Since I turned the dynamic sky off, that sun spot is no longer on the head there. I might still move these lights a little bit further apart from each other, but otherwise it's getting there. So you can see those are the real functions and fundamentals of getting a good rendering.